Hi guys, my name is Ani and today I'm going to be presenting about my remote controlled robot that I made with a Raspberry Pi. To begin, let's start with a small overview of what we're going to be talking about today. First of all, I'm going to introduce what the Raspberry Pi is and a few components that we'll need to build our robot. Secondly, we'll go into the building process and how to put together your components. Next, we're going to go into the coding and programming of the robot so we know how it works. And finally, I'll show you a small video of the final working robot so that you can also watch it with me. So let's begin. What is the Raspberry Pi? Well, simply speaking, the Raspberry Pi is a computer, just like a CPU or your desktop computer, that is the size of a credit card. So it's just this small. However, it has a lot of functionality. You can use it in small robots like the one we're going to make today because it's so small and light. Here you can see all of the components of the Raspberry Pi. There's GPIO pins, which we're going to be using heavily. These pins stand for General Purpose Input-Output pins. These pins can be programmed to send or receive information. Also, some important notes. There's 4 USB ports that you can use to connect your mouse and your keyboard. Also, there's an HDMI port which you can use to connect your PC so that I can see the user interface for the Raspberry Pi. Also, here's a little helpful diagram of the Raspberry Pi's pins, which you can use if you go into future projects with the Raspberry Pi. Continuing, let's go on to the components that we need for the project. There's 2 different types of components we'll need, electrical and physical. First, let's start with the electrical components. First of all, the Raspberry Pi, which we've already gone over. This will be the brain of the entire robot. Next, 4 AA batteries, which we'll be using to power the motors. Next, a battery pack right here. This is a power bank that we will be using to power the Raspberry Pi. Also an HDMI port like this. This will be used to connect our Raspberry Pi to the PC so we can see our user interface and code. Also an L293D motor driver module. We'll use this to communicate our code to the motors. And also a 4-pack of AA battery holder. And this will be used to put all of our AA batteries together. Now for the physical elements. These are going to be a PC, a keyboard, and a mouse, which we'll be using to access the Raspberry Pi. Also, we'll need 2 of these servo motors, as well as some male-female and male-male jumper wires, some support joint ball bearings, which we'll be using to support the robot, also some electric tape to tape some things together, and finally a breadboard, which we'll be using to put all of the wires and connections into. All of these components are going to have links in the end of the presentation, so you can find them, and if you want to build the robot yourself, you can use those links to buy these items. Here's some optional components that will also be linked at the end of the presentation. These components are really helpful to have, and they help in the process a lot. So first thing first, a Pi switch, which you can use to switch on and off your Raspberry Pi without needing to pull out the power cord every time. That's very helpful if you don't want to damage your Pi and you want to use it for a longer time. As well as a hot glue gun, which you can use to put things together very easily. Next up, we have a soldering iron and some lead-free solder. These are items that you can use to melt metal and put some metal components together. These are very helpful in other types of projects as well, so it's a good investment. Also, some foam mounting tape, which can be used to stick your Raspberry Pi onto the chassis. Also, a Raspberry Pi case. As you can see here, this is a case that I have. And this case is very useful because it protects your Raspberry Pi, and it also makes it so that your Raspberry Pi does not get damaged. And finally, a wire cutter / wire stripper, which you can use to cut up your wires and put them in easily, so you don't need any other scissors or any other tools. Next up, let's begin the building process. So now we're going to start constructing the chassis. A chassis is the body of the robot. There's two types of materials that you can use to build your body. So I used a nice cheap material, which are Legos. Most of you will have Legos lying around, but if you don't, you can also buy a laser cut professional chassis, which is much more sturdy. Here you can see the finished chassis. These are after they're constructed. So you can see the Lego chassis is much simpler and easy to build, but the laser cut chassis is much more stable. So those are the pros and cons. For the Legos, it's easy to build, very cheap, and it's deconstructible. But the problem with it is it's unstable and it might break. But the difference is with the laser cut chassis is it's more high-end, professional, and stable, but it's more expensive. So it's not a great choice if you have Legos lying around, and it's much easier to make it. Next up, let's start to build the frame. So let's flip over our chassis and add on our metal ball bearing. This metal ball bearing I hot glued to some Lego pieces so that it would be nice and high. Next up, we have to add on the motor, the servo motors on either side, and hot glue them on. And finally, you want to put the 4 battery pack on the back over here near the motors and insert your 4 AA batteries. After you finish building the bottom, let's add the main components on the top. So flip it again, all over again, and add on the power bank right here, as well as the Raspberry Pi, which is represented by this clear space right here, and also your breadboard, which will be in the back. And here you can see the finished Raspberry Pi robot build, and on here you can see that the HDMI port and the USB ports are out and they're facing so that you can easily access them later on. Also, the pins of the Raspberry Pi are facing the breadboard so that we can insert them very easily. Now it's time to show you the wire connections. I won't be explaining too in-depth, but if you want a very in-depth explanation of all of the things that we're going over today, you can also check that out on my YouTube channel, where I made a 20-minute long video about my Raspberry Pi robot, and it has a lot more specifics than this video. So here's the wiring, basic wiring procedures. You want to insert your L29 3D module into the breadboard and start wiring up your negative and positive power rails. Next up, you want to connect the bottom parts of the L29 3D to your positive power rail. And also you want to add on your motors to the middle of the L29 3D. And finally, you want to connect your Raspberry Pi's GPIO pins to the L29 3D. So here you can see I'm connecting it to the first side, and here connecting it to the second side. So you can follow these diagrams if you want to connect your robot yourself. Now let's start programming our robot. So you can see here I used a program known as PuTTY, which is a program that you can find for free online, and you want to download this software and connect it up to your Raspberry Pi. After you've done that, you can program your Raspberry Pi through your PC and use your mouse and keyboard to type in all of this code. This code is also included in the description of my YouTube video, so you can check that out. So now all of this code will be received by the Raspberry Pi, and that'll make the robot run. Now the final part of the process is connecting up your Wii Remote. So here you can see I just added the 2 required AA batteries that we need to run the Wii Remote, and then I ran my code in PuTTY. Here you can see it's asking me to press and hold the 1 and 2 buttons on the Wii Remote, which you can see here. And after you press them for a few seconds, the program should say that the connection is established and you can start moving your robot. So here you can see that the button diagram, and these are what each of the buttons do. So now let's finally see the finished robot in motion. Here's how it moves around. So as you can see there, the robot was being moved by the remote, and this is when everything is wired up and ready to go.
Here's how it moves around.
Okay, so at the end of the presentation, here are the component links that you can find on Amazon. They're all linked here, so you can go ahead and pick those up if you're interested. And also, if you have any questions, and if you want to make the robot yourself at home, you can always contact me through WhatsApp and ask all of your questions, and I'll be sure to answer them. That's the end of the presentation. So as I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And that's it. Thank you.